Well, hello everyone. This is the beginning of our course of lectures on Art History Survey 2, which pretty much begins in the 14th century and then extends as far to modern times as we'll be able to go. Much of it will depend on you, on your discussions, on your interest, and of course I will attempt to provide as much knowledge and information as possible on my side. Before we go there, however, I thought it is wise to give you a very brief history, an hour-long history of what had happened before. By necessity, it will be brief, even though we'll be covering something like 40,000 years in it. But the fact is that human creativity manifested itself from the very early times. Indeed, as you see here, some of the oldest known cave paintings date back as far as 40,000 BC. And they appeared everywhere. They appeared in Africa, in South America, they appeared in Asia. The ones we'll be looking at are the European part of the world, and these do date back, some of them, as I said, to 40,000 BC. The ones we'll be looking at are, here's Europe, Italy here, Spain, England, and we'll be looking mostly at the cave paintings here in the south of France, in the north of Spain. The Lascaux cave, the Chauvet cave, Altamira, of course. We will also go to Austria, in Willendorf. This is called the so-called prehistoric period, and that means it is a period before writing began. Therefore, whatever we know of human activity can only be gauged from what they left to us, can only be gauged from archaeology, essentially. And people at the time lived in the caves. Climate was very different. Climates changed many times. This was the period of Ice Age that lasted for thousands of years. We do not know what changes took place, but as you see here, cave dwelling, and these are the caves. Most of the caves, in fact, the paintings in the caves are located deep inside the caves, even though people themselves lived in the entrance of the caves. Here are recreations from the Museum of Natural History, and you might be interested in going and seeing that when possible. At the time, it's called the Stone Age. Stone tools were used. That's hence the name of it. And here are some of the paintings. They're obviously drawn with natural materials, coal, and they're drawn on the faces of the rocks providing this so-called three-dimensionality to many of the paintings. Many of these paintings, the majority of these paintings, in fact, are of animals. We do not know the meaning behind them. Common sense tells us that they were perhaps some sort of sympathetic images, images that many of these prehistoric people hunted, and by recreating the hunting process inside the caves, they therefore mystically encouraged successful hunting outside the caves, but no one can be very certain. Here are the paintings. These come from the south of France or north of Spain. If we go west to Austria, we find this delightful image of a female. Later on in the 19th century, she was called Venus of Willendorf because this statuette was found in Willendorf in Austria. Again, we do not know the meaning. There's no recorded memory of this. Therefore, again, we have to rely on common sense, and common sense tells us that this perhaps is a procreative image, a fertility image, because when you look at it, the fertility aspects of a female body are emphasized: the breasts, the hips, the nether regions, whereas as you see, there is not much of a face, not even much of legs. The arms, as you see, are very, very tiny, folded on top the breasts. It is a very small figurine. Actually, it fits in one's hand, even though it gives an impression of a large statue because of its very significant volumes. And we'll talk about art historical terminology as we go along. And now what we're going to do is, we started here, as you see, at the south of France, then north of Spain. We then advanced to Willdorf in Austria, and now we in fact going farther east. Right here we are going to today's Iraq and Egypt, right? Because this is, for our purposes, where civilization began. Right here in Iraq, that was called Mesopotamia, and Egypt. Europe at this time is an unknown quantity, and will not come to be known for thousands of years, and it will in fact adopt much of the Eastern civilizations. And here we are. This is Mesopotamia, this is Egypt. The reason it's called Mesopotamia is because the land lies between two rivers. Meso means middle, Potamos means a river. There are two rivers, one Euphrates, the other Tigris. Here is the land of Mesopotamia. And of course Egypt, we all know Egypt. We're going to Iraq first. As you see, between Iraq and Israel today, it forms a sort of a crescent, and that's what it is called, the Fertile Crescent, because while all the gray areas that you see here are either mountainous or deserts, the crescent that you're looking at as green was in fact, and still is, very fertile. And Mesopotamia, we go to Mesopotamia first. It's broken into a number of periods, which you do not have to remember, as the land and civilization in that land developed. Writing, in fact, appeared around 3000 BC, which is incredibly significant for our purposes, because that's when recorded history begins. As you see, the recorded history, the first period in Mesopotamia took place for a period of about 1,000 years, between 3000 and 2000. Then the next period, another 500 years. Still the next, still approximately another 1,000 years. And then finally between about the year 600 and the year 330, about when Alexander the Great of Greece conquered that area, and the area east of it belongs to still another period. Meanwhile, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. What's truly important to us is the beginning of writing, and writing began on clay tablets, on the wet clay tablets with a stylus, as you see it here. And the clay tablet writing developed from what you see as pictographs here to more of an abstract writing. Here, for instance, a pictograph of a bull's head from 3000 BC, and as it developed over time, it began to mean a bull. Here is a bull, and first the pictograph, and then it came to mean bread and food. Same here, head and the bowl together ultimately came to mean to eat. And as you see, this is what they in fact look like. I know it looks very confusing to us, but there are specialists who can read this. It's called wedge writing or cuneiform, and cuneiform means wedge writing. Here it is. And the great thing, of course, about it is that there are so many of them, and the ancient Mesopotamians pretty much described all aspects of their lives and made us heirs to that extraordinary knowledge. This is a clay town, a present-day clay town in present-day Morocco. It is a fortified village along the former caravan route between the Sahara and Marrakesh. And it serves as a very good example of what those Mesopotamian towns perhaps looked like, because southern Mesopotamia especially did not have masonry, did not have stone, and used clay not only for its writing but also for its buildings. And that's what the buildings may have looked like. They also used paint or glazed brick that also was glazed with color. And this is the mud brick. Mud bricks could either be sun-dried or they could be, of course, formed in a kiln. This is a recreation what an ancient Babylon may have looked like. Again, everything is mud brick, however, with glazed facing, and that glazed facing could assume a number of colors. And the colors blue and white were much in use. What you're looking at is the so-called ziggurat. It's called a ziggurat. It is a man-made mountain for the gods to live on. As I had said, southern Mesopotamia is a plain and doesn't have mountains. Gods were conceived at the time to be living on mountaintops, and since the Babylonians did not have mountains, they created them. And these are step pyramids, essentially, with a temple on the top. Here is one of the ziggurats as it survived to the present day. It is in the town of Ur, right here. We are looking right now at the area called the Sumer, which is southern Mesopotamia, and this is where civilization first appeared. The town of Ur, Uruk, Kish, Babylon, all of this belongs here. And the ziggurat of Ur. The step pyramid measured originally about 210 feet in length and about 150 feet in width, and about 100 feet in height. The height is speculative since only the foundations have survived. And you can see here what's happened to it. So all the entire top of the ziggurat did not survive to our present day. It is here that settled communities, in fact, began when the climate warmed up around the year 10,000, and by that time people began to move from previous dwellings. Also, particularly in North Africa, what used to be marshland, with the drying up of the climate, with the heating up of the earth, those marshlands were slowly but surely turning into deserts, and people tended to go towards the rivers. And this was the case in North Africa with the River Nile, and the same happened around Mesopotamia. So these river civilizations occurred. And the communities now began to be organized rather than hunter-gatherers. They began to domesticate animals and plants in the communities. They began to experiment with plants, learn how they grew, how they developed, create new species, in fact. This new knowledge led to the domestication of plants, and the archaeological data indicates that domestication of various types of plants and animals evolved in separate locations around 12,000 BC, that long ago. Writing did not begin until about 3000 BC, but by that time, for thousands of years, communities appeared along the rivers, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and began to organize themselves, sort themselves out. We go to Egypt now, and just as with Mesopotamia, the very long history of Egypt, which again extends for 3,000 years since the writing began. Obviously, there were settled communities since about 10,000 and before, but they are divided by scholars into the early dynastic period, which takes about 500 years, an old kingdom, another 500 years, between 2500 and 2000. There's a middle kingdom and the new kingdom. That's called the empire. So Egyptian history is also subdivided. And Egyptians had a lot of mountains, and they had a lot of stone, all sorts of stone. And as a result, they did not have to use mud brick as the Mesopotamians had to use everywhere. Egyptians used it as well for temporary dwellings, but for the gods they used stone, and they built the pyramids. Their first pyramid, in fact, also was a step pyramid of a different type than the Mesopotamian pyramids, but still a step pyramid. But then, for whatever reason, they decided to smooth it out, and as a result, we associate Egypt with the perfect pyramid. The Egyptian land extended deep into the south, and the Nile Valley, as I said, while the so-called cold period continued until about 10,000 BC, the valley was almost uninhabitable. It appears, however, that this clearance and irrigation was largely underway already by the 6th millennium. And that's just as in Mesopotamia, settled communities appeared. They were separate communities, each with its own traditions, each with its own gods, each with its own habits. But around 3000 BC, these separate communities were united under one rule, and the united Egypt emerged. And we know it again by its spectacular pyramids and its Sphinx that still very much survived. Here's the Sphinx today, and the Pyramid of Chephren behind him. Besides the pyramids, the Egyptians also built spectacular mortuary temples. And one of the great mortuary temples was in fact built under the reign of a female pharaoh by the name of Queen Hatshepsut. And here is her mortuary temple that is in fact very attractive to our modern eyes because it blends with the surrounding territory. It blends with the rocks behind and creates a very compelling image. However, we do have to remember that this actually was not the case when it was first created, because ancient civilizations loved color. And just as Babylonians loved color, the Mesopotamians, so did the Egyptians. And as a result, these temples were all faced with beautiful glazed bricks, or they were painted otherwise. They all had brilliant statuary to decorate them. They also had gardens everywhere. What is desert today was turned by the ancient Egyptians into fertile lands, and gardens, greenery, trees surrounded these temples. Today, as I said, they are stripped to their essentials, sort of like modern art, and as a result we see the bones, and the bones again are very, very compelling. Here is another image of the Hatshepsut temple. There's a recreation. There were a number of temples there, and here are the images of trees, but there were many more than we even see in this recreation. This is a bird's view of this temple, and we can see even more here how the temple was literally carved out of the mountain, and some portions of it were in fact carved out of the mountain, which means they were carved out of living rock, as the Sphinx in fact was carved out of an actual hill. He was not sculpted from masonry brought there. He was in fact sculpted out of carved out of the hill that was there, and parts of this temple also were carved out of the living rock. Egyptians painted a lot, but the only paintings that we have survived are those in their funerary chambers, in their mortuary chambers, because Egyptians believed thoroughly in the next life, and they in fact very much felt that life on earth is only preparation for the next life. Therefore, when one was interned, when one was buried, one had to be reminded of her life on earth in every detail. And as a result, just as with Mesopotamians, we know every aspect of their life from their writings. With Egyptians, it's the writings as well, but also their paintings. And the paintings, all these paintings come from their funerary complexes. They are done in fresco. Here it is. Some of this fresco technique was combined with relief technique. And relief is when portion of the image is relieved from the wall, as you see it here. So plaster would be applied to the wall, then parts of it would be carved out. The image would thus be created as projecting from the wall, then that image would be colored in the fresco technique. And we see here the cows, they're fording the river. Here's the river. We see here men working in the fields. The Egyptians described everything. Here more frescoes, and this time this is the domestic life of a pharaoh. Types of cosmetics used, the dancing girls entertaining the diners. Really a true great wealth of information. We know so much about Egypt because of this remarkable stone that was found by the soldiers of Napoleon in the year approximately 1800, when Napoleon invaded Egypt. And in the north, his soldiers found a stone that was written in 3 languages. That was immediately apparent. It is called the Rosetta Stone because it was found near the town of Rosetta in the Nile Delta. And at that time, all educated people read Latin and read Greek. And one of the the bottom portion of the stone was written in Greek and could easily be read. Until then, hieroglyphics could not be read because by now, for almost 2,000 years, nobody used hieroglyphics, and of course the language was forgotten, which was the same in fact with cuneiform. But an extraordinary man by the name of Jean-Francois Champollion, who was a brilliant linguist, was in fact able, by using the Greek text, to decipher the other 2 texts. And it turned out that the text in the middle was the so-called Demotic, a later Egyptian that was used commonly in the streets, and then the upper text was in classical hieroglyphics. It was also very apparent from the very beginning to all that the same message was written in all the three languages, which is why it was able, which is why Champollion ultimately was able to decipher it. A similar writing was later discovered also in Mesopotamia, which again gave the key to deciphering of the cuneiform texts. And as a result, because both the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians wrote so much, their civilizations became an open book. Unfortunately, we don't have as many fresco paintings from Mesopotamia as we do from Egypt, because Mesopotamians, their belief in afterlife was very different from the Egyptians. They felt it was something murky and undesirable. Also, because all their buildings were built of mud brick, they disappeared. We do have statuary, however. And then, of course, the ziggurats. Both civilizations produced tremendous art. And now we go back to Europe, slowly but surely. So we started with the cave paintings from 30,000 BC, Venus of Willendorf, which were produced by cave living societies. Then we jumped over to Iraq and Egypt, and this is where written civilizations began. This is where cities began to be built. This is where thoughts began to be written down. This is where literature, in fact, began. The great epic of Gilgamesh, dating originally to about 2500 BC, came from Sumer, right here. And now we're going from these civilizations, we go to Greece. We're going back west, because while civilizations, written civilizations again, appeared in the east, they slowly but surely began to move west. To Greece we now go. Here it is. So Iran, here's Euphrates, this is Iraq, this is Egypt. There were also civilizations, of course, in Syria, but now we are going to Greece. That was truly the founder of our Western civilization. When Greek civilization as we know it began about 800 BC, it began in its geometric forms, because, well, geometry is easy to convey. It's much easier than figurative painting. However, pottery is our key to the development of many cultures. However, while in the 9th, 8th century, right here, we see these geometric imagery. I mean, obviously there were a lot of pots that were just unadorned altogether. But we see that by this time there's this desire for decoration appears. And here we see it. However, within 300 years into the 6th century, this is what we see. So a great progression from geometric, simpler forms to far more sophisticated, interesting forms in Greek pottery. And the same happened in sculpture. 8th century, we see this figurine of a male and a centaur, which is very geometric and to our modern eyes, in fact, may appear very attractive. Because, of course, 20th century began to look back at those cultures and began to look back at human creation at the time that was not, as they considered, despoiled by later sophistication. Well, this is, yes, this is the pre-sophistication imagery, and it is very geometric. We see the same thing with a male figure. It's called kouros, that just means a youth, a male youth in Greece. And circa 600, he is stiff, he is geometric, quite Egyptian in fact, in many ways. But literally within 50 years about, he began to move, began to acquire more human forms. The carving, whereas you see that the carving was not done between the fists and the body, Here everything is now carved, still stiff, still rigid, but you can see the progression. And finally, this is sort of the same thing as with the vases. We are with our New York Kouros, I mean he's Greek of course, circa 600, and then this is 450. Over 150 years we progress from a very stiff, rigid form to a very human, very pliant, very flexible form. And he is called Doryphorus, means spear bearer, because originally he was an athlete with a spear in his hand and lying on, resting on his shoulder. And by now we know the name of the sculptor, which also tells us a lot about the progression of art along with the progression of humanity. Whereas in these cases the creators are, we don't know their names, because their creation is far more important than their creator. As you see, by the middle of the 5th century, a creator is also important. A human being becomes very important, and as such we begin to know his name. And in fact the same happened with pottery, whereas obviously we have no idea who threw this pot on the pottery wheel. Here we have in fact a name of Euphronius, who was a great painter of 6th century BC, vase painter. Here it is. So humanity is becoming important as well as human creation. Same process will happen in the Renaissance, but it is important that you know that the Renaissance was not a new beginning, but that these similar processes happened earlier. We looked at painting, we looked at sculpture, we're going to look at architecture. All of it is now going to be quite important for our studies of Renaissance, because Renaissance means rebirth, and then from Renaissance most of the artistic forms will be taken on later into the later centuries, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, even 20th. Architecture, the Greeks, again, with the Greeks, they developed 3 major orders of architecture, as it will eventually become known. The most important one for the Greeks themselves was the so-called Doric order, and it was a very simple order. It consisted of a column, a fluted column. It consisted of, this is called the capital, right here, very simple pillow-like stone cap. Originally it was all wood, of course, but later on became stone. And then architrave, and these types are called the metope is the flat portion, and the grooved portion is called the triglyph. When you see these, think of a construction of a house, and when the house today is constructed, a wooden house for instance, the beams would stick out, and then the space would be filled between the beams with just flat materials. And so the beams later became, with the Greeks, became these triglyphs, the 3 grooves symbolically, and the flat space in between is called the metope. So this is the Doric order. It has no base. The column has no base. It sits directly on the stylobate. It sits directly on the stone ground. The next Greek order will be called the Ionic order. It acquires a base. It's also a fluted column with a little flat space between the flutes. That's called a fillet. They abandoned, the Greek architects abandoned the metopes and triglyphs and created a continuous frieze. And the reason for that was that with metopes and triglyphs, the metopes were often decorated with sculpture, but then they all had to be separate decorations. Sort of as you read a book and look at the pictures. There's separate pages for pictures, whereas at some point they preferred a scroll or a film, a continuous design. And the Doric design, the Doric order disallowed that, whereas of course the Ionic allowed a continuous design. And then instead of, for the capital, instead of just a plain pillow, we have these volutes or ram's horns, if you will. All these forms are taken ultimately from organic forms. And then the very third order that the Greeks invented but did not prefer, but Romans loved. And that is essentially the same in all its essentials as the Ionic order, except instead of the volutes, now we have this basket covered with leaves, the acanthus leaves. And this is called the acanthus leaf capital. There, in some of these, the volutes are still present. The base is present in both orders. And here we have it. So here's your original Doric order. As the Greeks saw it, the Doric order was their original order. It was very masculine, very stout, very powerful. Here, as you see, very plain. This one actually doesn't have the flutes, but a number of them will. And here are the metopes and triglyphs. Just where you see the triglyphs, just imagine those wooden beams sticking out. I mean, that's what this is about. The Ionic order has the base, has these ram's horns, and the continuous frieze, right here. And then finally, the Corinthian order, as it is called, has the acanthus leaves in stone as its capital. Here, the acanthus grows everywhere around the Mediterranean, and in the spring it in fact flowers very, very beautifully. And because it's so ubiquitous, well, for whatever reason, it came to designate the third order of the Greek architecture. Renaissance will adopt all these three orders, and as such will also open the doors to later European art and architecture into the same technique. The greatest time of Greece came in the 5th century BC, the artistic time of Greece, with the building of the Acropolis. Acropolis means, polis in Greek means a city, acro means high, a city on high. When we talk about acrobats, they are people who perform at great heights. And here is the entire hill in Greece. This is what it looks like today. This is a recreation of what it may have looked in the middle of the 5th century with its great Doric temples. As you see, there are metopes everywhere, metopes and triglyphs, with great statues of Athena, who was the patron goddess of Athens. That's where Athens takes its name. This is the Acropolis. It was a sacred center of the city. The city was under the hill. You can see various buildings there, the meeting place under the hill, but up on the hill, sort of as with the ziggurats. That was the sacred precinct. And the greatest building there is called the Parthenon, which is dedicated to Athena. Parthenos means virginal, and the Parthenon is the temple that's dedicated to the virginal Athena. Here it is. Here it is again. These are the gates into the sacred precinct. And this is what it looks like today. The city of Athens, as you see under the hill. On top of the hill is the Parthenon in its unfortunate state today, even though the Greek government had made great attempts at restoring what they could, and works are still continuing. So here is the Parthenon from the side as we see it today. It is a Doric temple, as you see. They are plain plain pillows, stone pillows for the capitals, and metopes triglyphs. It is done in perfect proportion, and it is considered one of the greatest buildings in the world, and indeed it was imitated thousands and thousands of times all over the world. And in fact, in Princeton, the School of Politics today is a modern Parthenon. And Nashville, Tennessee also has a recreated Parthenon as well. So this was considered one of the greatest buildings. In fact, there will be two buildings that will be imitated on numerous occasions. One of them is Parthenon, very important to remember. Here, what it may have looked like when it was first built, again, color everywhere. It was built, the entire building was built of marble, but much of it was colored because, as I said, ancient civilizations loved color. And now we're going further west. From Greece now we go to Rome, because during the 5th century BC, when Greece was at its height, Rome was still very much in its first stages of development, and in fact considered by these Eastern civilizations, the civilizations of Egypt or Mesopotamia or Syria or Greece, as essentially, as they called them, primitive societies. The various cities in Rome, various communities, still very much they fought between one another for supremacy. Ultimately, Rome will, of course, prevail. And not only ultimately Rome will prevail, but it will spread around the entire Mediterranean, and it will take over the Eastern civilizations, take over Greece, Egypt, as you see, Syria. And as it spread eastward especially, it will adopt the cultures of the East, because while Romans were great soldiers and organizers, their art was in very indefinite stages. But once they were exposed to those extraordinary cultures of the East, they will adopt their art forms as well. There's a saying that while Rome conquered Greece militarily, physically, Rome was conquered by Greece intellectually. So Rome will adopt all these architectural orders to their own uses, and Rome will import Greek painters and Syrian painters and Egyptian artists to Italy in order to create their own art. Here is a good example of a Roman temple that comes to us from about the year 0 for convenience. It was built sometime during the age of Augustus, when Christ was born. And this is a typical temple, Roman temple, but as you see, something very significant had happened. While it is a Ionic temple, and we see the Ionic porch, the entrance is from the front. The columns around are now purely decorative. They do not carry any weight as they did in Greece. Here is the comparison. For the Greeks, the idea of symmetry, the idea of wholeness was extremely important. The organic wholeness. They felt that their art, their architecture reflected the celestial order of the universe, and they wished to build and to paint according to the universal rules as they perceived them. Romans, on the other hand, were not so much intellectual as they were practical. They were very, very practical people. And to them, making the columns go all the way around just didn't make sense, since the entrance was from the front. And thus they emphasized the front and sent the columns around as decoration. Much more economical, and the idea is preserved. So thus, Roman mentality. One of the greatest Roman buildings, which will be as important to future generations and Renaissance and later to European history, and from Europe, of course, to America, is the building that's called the Pantheon, not to be confused with the Parthenon. Parthenon is the temple to the goddess Athena. Pantheon is the temple of all gods, as in Pan American Airlines, the airlines of all Americas. And here, Pantheos is God, Pantheon, the temple of all gods. It has the front, it's very traditional, as we see it here, here as well. But then behind the front, nothing is traditional. This was built under the Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century AD, and his architect attached a circular form to a traditional portico, which created an impression of entering inside a celestial sphere when one walks inside, because the height, the width of the buildings are the same, and one can in fact inscribe a circle inside the interior of the Pantheon. Because it was converted into a Christian church, it survived almost intact. Inside we see the original polychrome marbles, multicolored marbles, and the original architectural design. And so these two buildings, the Greek Parthenon and the Roman Pantheon, will be extremely important in our survey. While Greeks pretty much used the rectilinear architecture, the two posts and a lintel, the Romans loved the arch. And here is the arch. The typical Roman arch is self-sustaining. It is created by the pressure of these trapezoid stone blocks onto each other, held together by the keystone. So at first this is how the arch is created, with wooden centering, but once the arch is there, it can hold itself, often without mortar. And then so the centering is taken out and the arch stays there. The arch can also be extended to create the so-called barrel vault, and then when two barrel vaults intersect, a groin vault is created. The barrel vaulting can be curved, as you see here, can be manipulated, especially when the Romans invented cement or concrete. And with concrete, they could do absolutely anything. The secret of concrete will be lost soon enough after the fall of Rome, and then recovered by the Europeans. But from the arch, as you see, the dome can also be created. And the dome of the Pantheon is done in cement. This is another great example of a Roman arch. This is an aqueduct that also comes from the 1st century BC. The year 0 would be convenient enough. And it lives in the south of France. Romans were great engineers. They may not have been great artists, but they were spectacular engineers. They built roads that are still used, bridges that are still used, and needless to say, Roman law as it was codified, in fact, in the 6th century AD. A lot of Europe still lives according to it, well known today as Code Napoleon, and in our country, Louisiana, and the French parts, of course, of Canada as well. Between the 4th and the 5th centuries, great hordes of Germanic tribes and also the Huns from the east invaded Western Europe and invaded Rome and destroyed Roman civilization. Libraries disappeared, writing disappeared, washing disappeared, because with the destruction of the aqueducts, Roman baths were destroyed as well, and humanity soon enough sunk to the level of a beast of burden. The former Roman Empire, as you see here, will ultimately be divided between its eastern part and its western part, because the Germanic hordes and the Huns did not affect the eastern part of the empire. They did, however, affect the western part of the empire, and the Roman Western Empire ceased to exist as such. With time, it will be split into various countries as we know them today, and Italy, France, Spain, Germany will appear separately, while the Eastern Roman Empire, that will be called the Byzantine Empire, will survive for another 1,000 years. It is this part, however, that concerns us. Between about 500 and the year 1000. Now these are very approximate dates, of course, just so that you have an idea of what went on before our survey period. And basically my philosophy, so that you know, on dates I will never require specific dates of you, but the approximate periods will be important. Well, between about 500 and 800, life was very dismal. Things began to stir up a bit around the year 800, and then by the year 1000, Europe began to wake up. And that's when our medieval period begins. I mean, technically the early medieval period is between 500 and about 1000, but the development begins around the year 1000. And when it does begin, and specifically in Italy, because Italy never quite lost sight of the greatness that Rome was, whenever they needed art, they looked for it in the Byzantine Empire. And in the Byzantine Empire, which was, they always called themselves Romans. However, their language was Greek, their faith was Christian, not pantheistic as it was with Rome. And their art developed accordingly more into abstract forms and not following the classical forms of Rome. The majority of art, of course, was dedicated to religion. And here is a good example of Christ the Almighty, the All-Powerful, which is this word, Pantocrator means Christ the Almighty. It comes from the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai. And let's see, the Sinai Peninsula is right here, sort of towards the south of the Sinai Desert. And that was part of the Byzantine Empire, as you see. The image is two-dimensional, looking at us straightforwardly. Christ holds the Bible in his hands and blesses us with his right hand, and a halo behind him is also two-dimensional. It's not quite abstract, but it is not naturalistic either. It's meant to convey a message, and as such, it does convey a message. Here, from the same 6th century, also from St. Catherine, comes an image of the Virgin and Child enthroned among the saints, and again, quite two-dimensional. We jump 6 centuries because not much changed, and Byzantine image, late 13th century, the Madonna now begins to move. She's still quite two-dimensional, and in order to convey pleats in her garment, the so-called striation is used, as you see here, sort of these flat areas of yellow with the rays coming out. This image, in fact, is in the National Gallery. And the early 12th century, this is from Greece, the art of mosaic was used a lot, in addition to the art of fresco, painting on the wall, because mosaic was much more durable. And here is the image of crucified Christ, again two-dimensional, between Virgin Mary and Saint John. Around the year 1000, about the same time, 1100, there began movements. The movement towards religious centers, pilgrimages, and then in the year 1098 there was announced the so-called First Crusade, because what will happen by this time, you see, the former Byzantine Empire that occupied all this area will be pushed out by the Eastern Seljuk Turks, and the Byzantine itself, you see, will just relegate to the purple areas, whereas the Turks will take over everything else. What you see as purple stripes are the areas that Crusades will reconquer, because Crusades began with the desire to free the Christian lands right here from the Muslim rule. And ultimately the Crusaders will conquer these territories, but not for long, for under 100 years. And then other eastern tribes will come and reconquer it from the west. But what the Crusades will achieve, however, is the great movement of the people. So the culture, we watched the culture coming from east to west, from Iraq, Egypt, Greece, then Rome, and then Rome spread that culture around the Mediterranean. Then that fell apart. But around the year 1500 years after that fell apart, there is a great movement back east. And as they go back east, these Western knights, medieval knights, who are Christian but have absolutely no culture whatsoever, they see something they had never seen before. They see these brilliant lands, different civilizations, different types of life. They bring it with them back west. And what will happen is that trade will begin around the Mediterranean as a result of all this. And at the center of the trade will be Italy, because everybody who wants to go east, most of them will go to Italy, and then the Italians will ship them to the east. As a result, the Italian towns, many Italian towns, will become very wealthy by, say, the 12th century. And among them is the Republic of Florence. The Republic of Florence, this is where our survey will really begin, because this is where Renaissance art will in fact begin. I realize this has been a lot of information in this 1 hour, but we will discuss it when we see one another. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon.